In Chapter 1, the protagonist, a scholar, reflects on her research and the unusual fairy foot she is carrying in her knapsack. She heads to breakfast with Wendell and notices her disheveled appearance due to an obsessive research period. On her way to the campus, she passes students in the common room, reflecting on campus traditions and superstitions. Outside, she encounters a strange man covered in ribbons who cryptically speaks about a mysterious path and ominous warnings. After he disappears, she resumes her walk, contemplating the strange encounter. Shadow, her dog, remains uninterested in the man. In Chapter 2, Emily meets Wendell at their usual breakfast spot where she recounts a peculiar encounter with a mysterious man holding ribbons. Wendell dismisses it humorously, mentioning possible fairy threats. As they continue their conversation, Emily hints at a breakthrough in her research, particularly regarding Wendell's fairy door. Wendell jokes about her research obsession while she grows more serious about solving the mystery. During the conversation, a scholar interrupts, mentioning Wendell's influence, revealing rumors about him spreading at Cambridge. Emily worries about the implications of these rumors, especially regarding their funding and Wendell's secret fairy identity. In Chapter 3, Emily confronts a tense situation involving Wendell, Ariadne, and Dr. Rose. After Ariadne locates the elusive Spengler maps, Emily becomes concerned about Wendell's well-being, suspecting he was poisoned the night before. Rose storms into Emily's office, accusing her of aiding Wendell and threatening to ruin her career with fabricated evidence of malpractice. Later, during Wendell's lecture, fairy assassins, the Grey Shiri, burst in. Wendell uses magic to fight them off with the help of enchanted pencils and a fairy coracle. The situation escalates, leading to chaos in the museum, where Emily ultimately aids Wendell's escape while Rose watches, helpless. In Chapter 4, Emily and Wendell prepare for an expedition to Austria, seeking a fairy nexus tied to Danielle de Grey's research. They argue about Wendell's recovery and the need to leave Cambridge, as his stepmother sends assassins after him. Wendell is reluctant, but eventually agrees to go, and Ariadne insists on joining them despite Wendell's reservations. Emily reveals the foot of a tree fawn, a key to locating the nexus. Dr. Rose unexpectedly arrives, offering his expertise in exchange for silence about his previous threats. The group heads to the train station, with Emily reflecting on her complicated relationship with Wendell. In Chapter 5, Emily, Wendell, and Ariadne are traveling to Austria to investigate a fairy nexus. Emily encounters the mysterious ribbons man again on the train, who gives cryptic directions and claims to be lost in fairy. Emily suspects the man might be another assassin sent by Wendell's stepmother. After discussing the encounter with Ariadne and Dr. Rose, who suggests gathering more evidence, Emily finds Wendell's compartment inexplicably transformed, with fairy magic causing a chaotic scene. Wendell admits he's been suffering from poisoning, and his magic is affected. The group continues their journey facing increasing danger. In Chapter 6, Emily, Wendell, and Ariadne arrive at St. Liesel after a difficult but scenic journey through the Alps. They stay at a guest house run by Julia Haas, where they discuss their research on fairy doors and Danielle de Grey's disappearance. Julia mentions finding a ribbon tied to a root, and Emily is intrigued by the local custom of using salt-soaked ribbons to mark trails through the mountains. Later, Wendell and Emily explore a fairy door near a lake. Wendell dismisses the small fae, but Emily remains hopeful. The chapter ends with Emily realizing their guest house has 4 bedrooms, not 3. In Chapter 7, Emily, Wendell, and Ariadne prepare to survey the mountains around St. Liesel for signs of fairy doors. After a restless night, Emily finds scratches on their door suggesting local folk activity. Wendell and Ariadne straighten up their quarters, and the group discusses their strategy for the day, identifying potential door sites using de Grey's maps before interviewing locals. Despite resistance from Dr. Rose, who insists on speaking with townsfolk first, Emily holds firm on her plan. Before departing, Elsa confirms the folks' involvement and warns them to adjust their offerings. The chapter closes as the group heads into the mountains. In Chapter 8, Emily, Wendell, and Ariadne continue their survey of St. Liesel using de Grey's maps, identifying 14 fairy doors. Wendell reveals that some doors lead to unfamiliar fairy realms while others are mundane. After a long day, Emily reassures Wendell of their progress and they discuss their past adventures. Wendell opens up about his kingdom, and Emily contemplates her future with him, unsure about marriage. Back in St. Liesel, Rose apologizes for his previous behavior and shares a tragic story about a friend who fell victim to the folk, warning Emily of the risks of trusting Wendell too much. In Chapter 9, Emily and her group continue investigating fairy doors in the mountains. They encounter more mysterious marks on their doors, suggesting possible fairy involvement. Roland Haas guides them to the final path of Danielle de Grey, but the group faces unsettling weather and terrain. As they explore a valley, Emily notices strange behavior from a fairyfoot and a peculiar forest. They discover bones in the area, suggesting a fairy presence. Soon after, they encounter dangerous fox-like fairies that attack Rose, but Emily's enchanted cloak protects her, allowing her to fend them off and rescue Rose. In Chapter 10, Wendell reluctantly heals the injured Rose, leaving him with peculiar silver scars. Emily encounters the mysterious man she believes to be Professor Eichhorn, lost in a fairy borderland. Eichhorn confirms Danielle de Grey had found the Nexus but never returned. He urges Emily to find and free de Grey, who might still be trapped. Emily considers how her growing knowledge of fairy doors and her connection to Wendell might help. Her sense of the supernatural world expands as she grapples with the moral weight of her choices. In Chapter 11, the weather clears, enabling the group to return to the valley where they find one fairy door but little else of immediate consequence. Emily informs Wendell of her encounter with Eichhorn, which shifts his perspective on focusing their search on de Grey. They learn from the locals that de Grey and Eichhorn have both been sighted in the area over the decades, with de Grey appearing younger each time, suggesting she's lost not only in space but in time. The villagers' folklore links the tree fawns to the Nexus's location, raising the stakes and the potential danger of their search. In Chapter 12, Emily, Wendell, Rose, and Ariadne attempt another search of the Grunsage Valley. While there, Wendell briefly investigates a fairy door in the forest and encounters hostile winterfolk. A sudden appearance of strange clouds and Wendell's worsening condition lead the group to retreat through a series of chaotic magical escapes. They ultimately end up in a self-conjured fairy castle where Wendell battles the elder huntsman, barely surviving the encounter. After returning to their cottage, Emily finds a dark fairy tale paralleling Wendell's condition, hinting that the shadowy birds within him may be a fatal omen. In Chapter 13, Emily seeks Poe's help for Wendell's illness, using a mysterious key that opens a path to fairy. She travels through the Winterlands with the help of a fox fairy named Snowbell, encountering Poe in the Kyrderskoger. Poe gives Emily cakes to relieve Wendell's symptoms and offers to inquire about news of Wendell's court. Emily learns more about the connections between different fairy realms, and she receives a strange gift, a door made from bone. After several fairy journeys, Emily and Snowbell return to St. Liesel, where the boundary between worlds remains unsettlingly fluid. In Chapter 14, Wendell begins recovering after eating Poe's cakes, but remains weak. Emily reflects on her struggle to stay hopeful and tries to focus on her work, though her mind is preoccupied. One evening, she follows a voice into the night which leads her on a confusing journey through a foggy mountainside where fairy doors seem to shift the landscape. After an unsettling encounter that might have involved Professor de Grey, she becomes lost in the borderlands of fairy. Wendell eventually finds her, guiding her back to the mortal world, and they camp for the night, rekindling their connection. In Chapter 15, Emily and Wendell discuss the threats they face, including Wendell's stepmother and her attempts to have him killed. Wendell shares his reluctant knowledge about the Fae politics that have led to this danger. Emily then pursues Eichhorn's ribbons, and with Wendell's reluctant help, they track him down, eventually pulling him from fairy. After returning to the cottage, they plan their next steps to find de Grey and the Nexus. As they search the area, fawns attack them, but their chaos is momentarily subdued by the villagers throwing vegetables at the creatures. Despite the brief victory, Emily feels the weight of their precarious situation. In Chapter 16, the group returns to the cottage to find it altered by fairy magic. Wendell, still weak, is determined to join the search for the Nexus, but Ariadne prevents him from leaving. Meanwhile, Emily realizes that the fairy foot and the horn carried by de Grey are connected, drawing Eichhorn and de Grey back together. As the Fae press closer to the cottage, Wendell uses his powers to pull de Grey from fairy. However, she is reluctant to help them, dismissing their efforts as misguided. Emily, determined, decides that the key to saving Wendell lies in retrieving his cat, Orga. In Chapter 17, Emily determines that Wendell's magical cat, Orga, may be the only way to heal him and plans a journey into faerie to retrieve it. Despite Emily's objections, Ariadne insists on accompanying her. The group's departure is hastened when villagers, angry about the recent fawn attack, decide to evict them. Before leaving, a small fairy ally, Poe, brings news of Wendell's stepmother's expanding power and gives Emily a compass tied to faerie's mysteries. The chapter concludes as Emily and Ariadne step into Wendell's otherworldly realm, armed with faerie artifacts and a determined resolve. In Chapter 18, Emily and Ariadne navigate through Wendell's realm, relying on the sun, stars, and a faulty compass to guide them. They venture into a forest filled with eerie, floating baubles and strange, glowing creatures. As they travel, they encounter occasional faerie activity, including distant laughter and the sound of music. After a long day, they follow a tattered faerie dragging a cart but choose to pass quietly. Despite the strange occurrences, they press on, their goal still uncertain, but their resolve to reach Wendell's court unshaken. The landscape is as beautiful as it is unsettling. In Chapter 19, Emily and Ariadne spend the night by a lake in Wendell's realm, trying to rest while dealing with strange sights and sounds. Emily experiments with a fragment of the fawn's horn, grinding it into powder, suspecting it could be the poison that affects Wendell. She wonders if it could be used to create an antidote for Dr. Bambleby. Although unsure how to proceed, Emily considers consulting a scientist. Despite the disturbing effects of their environment, their investigation into the poison leads to new possibilities for their quest. The chapter highlights the dangers of the realm and their growing urgency. In Chapter 20, Emily and Ariadne find shelter beneath a large, eerie yew tree where they set up camp. Despite Emily's mistrust, they rest after a long journey. Emily takes the first watch, constantly worrying about Wendell's safety. When Ariadne wakes to relieve her, Emily remains vigilant, feeling increasingly uneasy about the tree. Her instincts prove right when a deer of faerie, enraged by their campfire, attacks Ariadne. Emily acts quickly, using her cloak to shield her niece. The creature retreats, terrified, and Emily reflects on their ongoing dangers in faerie, knowing they must proceed with caution. In Chapter 21, Emily and Ariadne continue their journey through faerie, troubled by the dangers posed by Wendell's enchanted cloak. Snowbell, a small faerie, reveals he has been following them and offers to guide them to the Queen's court, warning them that they are taking the wrong path. He leads them to a barrow, a shortcut through perilous lands, but Emily's compass points to Snowbell rather than the door. Despite her doubts, she decides to trust him, realizing they are bypassing significant parts of the realm, including dangerous areas like the Weeping Mines and the Poetry. In Chapter 22, Emily and Ariadne reach Wendell's stepmother's castle after passing through a series of eerie faerie barrows. The landscape surrounding the castle is breathtaking, but the looming guardians, giant owl-like creatures with spider limbs, fill them with dread. Snowbell, their guide, mentions that these guardians typically do not attack unless hungry. Emily decides to approach the castle alone, trusting in deception rather than stealth. She plans to pretend to be someone unremarkable, drawing from past experiences with faerie courts. Despite Ariadne's protests, Emily remains resolute in her approach, determined to proceed at dawn. In Chapter 23, Emily prepares for her dangerous mission in the faerie castle, leaving Ariadne behind with Snowbell. Emily enters the castle ground and encounters several courtly fae, including a guard who initially threatens her but is charmed by her feigned scholarly demeanor. After some time, Emily finds Wendell's cat, Orga, but the creature leads her to a mysterious door from which voices and laughter emanate. After capturing the cat, Emily is confronted by Wendell's stepmother, the Queen, who offers Emily power in exchange for helping her kill Wendell. Emily poisons the Queen's wine, escapes through a window, and begins a frantic escape from the castle. In Chapter 24, Wendell awakens to find Emily exhausted and asleep over her journal, her recent experiences in faerie taking their toll. While Emily sleeps, Wendell recounts the events following her daring escape with Orga and her encounter with the Queen. Wendell describes his own physical recovery thanks to Orga's intervention, the arrival of the ancient guardian Rescarden, and his summoning of the Veil to drive back his stepmother's loyal protectors. Ultimately, the faerie nexus becomes sealed, preventing further access to Wendell's realm for now, leaving Emily and Wendell to rest and recover at the cottage. In Chapter 25, Emily and Wendell prepare to leave St. Liesel, with Wendell's meticulous packing and delays causing some frustration. The villagers, showing gratitude but no awe towards Wendell, host a farewell feast. Emily feels unsettled by their warmth and struggles with guilt over her actions. She shares a heartfelt moment with Ariadne, acknowledging her growth and importance. Later, Wendell discusses his family's legacy and his humble origins. Emily reassures him that she will stay by his side. They reflect on the value of the common fae, with Wendell acknowledging his previous underestimation of them. In chapter 26, Emily and Wendell settle into a grand house by the sea, preparing for their journey to Wendell's kingdom. They are accompanied by allies from the common fae, including fauns, trolls, and fuchsverge, all of whom will assist in their quest. Emily reflects on their plans and the uncertainty of what lies ahead in Wendell's realm. Wendell, now recovered from the poison, jokes about their leisurely preparations. Emily, though excited, is also anxious, especially as she prepares to leave behind her scholarly life. Together, they set out for Wendell's kingdom, their next adventure awaiting.